FLM, wide open thinking, world-class work, and far-reaching results. Now with locations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C. A strategic marketing and communications company dedicated to serving clients who specialize in the business of agriculture and the life of rural communities.
Thanks for joining us today for our Meet the Farmhands video. Joined today by Joel Leftwich, the Chief of Staff of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Joel, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
For starters, can you give us a little bit of an idea of the timeline of your career throughout your time in Washington, the places you've been, where you've worked, what you've learned throughout those processes?
Sure, happy to. I think my pathway has been a little unique, though I imagine everyone that you interview is going to have that same answer. I didn't grow up on a farm. I'm not a farm kid. I grew up in a small town in Kansas that was a farming community, but I'm a SOB, as I like to say, son of a banker. And my father continues to work at a primarily ag lending facility in our hometown of Wellington. And so I got to know agriculture kind of through his work, through the lending side. You know, if producers had a good year, he had a good year. If they had a tough year, my dad had a tough year. So, you know, I kind of had agriculture from that perspective built into my brain as I went through. I came to DC right after undergrad. I answered an anonymous ad for a staff assistant for a congressman from Kansas, and I was lucky enough to get it. I graduated from my alma mater, and then a week later moved to DC with a couple of suitcases. Didn't know too many people here, but I had a great experience with that office. I worked for Congressman Jim Ryan as his staff assistant. A few months in, he asked me to work on agriculture issues as well, which I did. And that was my first kind of entrance into ag policy. After a year in that office, I got a great opportunity to move back to Kansas and work for Friends University, where I went to school. I was there for a couple of years, then did graduate school at Loyola of Chicago. And when I was finishing grad school, I got a call from a former co-worker who was then with the Bush administration to come out and interview for some jobs in DC. I ended up at USDA in their Congressional Relations Office for a year and worked with some really wonderful people, and then came to Senator Roberts' office in his personal office. Since then, I've worked in the private sector a little bit. I've worked for Senator Roberts here, both his personal office staff and the Ag Committee staff.
So about 15 years ago then, you were a staff
Don't say it like that. Let's just not put 15.
Okay, a little bit of time ago, yeah. You were a staff assistant on the House side, and now you're the chief of staff for a Senate committee. You know, some people would say that's a fairly quick rise. I'm sure you know, being in the perspective of actually having lived it, you might seem a little bit longer than that. But that's a fairly quick rise in the grand scheme of staff positions on Capitol Hill.
It seems like it's gone very quickly. I mean, we've dealt a lot with a lot of policy issues in the last 15 years. I've worked on energy policy, transportation policy, and agriculture policy. I'd say I've been very blessed to work with a great boss who has several great bosses, but certainly Chairman Roberts. He is one who takes time to develop staff. He likes to say, "I'll give you enough rope to hang yourself." So he puts a lot of responsibility on our shoulders as staff. But he's also there to provide guidance. And, you know, through the years, I've had great legislative directors, I've had great chiefs of staffs, and I've had great staff directors that I've worked for here on the Hill, and then some great bosses outside of the Hill who've been very helpful to me along my career. So I've just been blessed and lucky.
Most of the time that you spent in Washington has been on Capitol Hill, but as you mentioned, you spent some time in the private sector. One tenure, I believe, was about 3 years. Another was about 3 months, which even in the grand scheme of Washington job lengths, that's a pretty short one. You kept coming back to the Hill. I mean, it's almost like you like it or something. I mean, what brings you back?
I do like the Hill, but first and foremost, it's Chairman Roberts. So my work in the private sector and then coming back to the Hill has been because of him. It's because he's called and asked me to come back, and I've had great opportunities off the Hill. But he is someone who I can constantly learn from, And opportunities have arisen to work for him in different capacities that, one, are interesting to me, but also have been very challenging, but at the same time unique, and I want to take advantage of the opportunity. If it weren't for Pat Roberts, if it were any other member, it wouldn't have worked out like that.
Mm-hmm. So throughout your time building up through the leadership ranks on Capitol Hill and otherwise, what would you say has been the biggest lesson that you've learned throughout all your jobs in all the capacities that you worked for, be it in the private sector, be it for Senator Roberts, what have you?
I think it starts when you first start out in any sort of professional career, whatever your profession is, and if it's certainly here on Capitol Hill, it's to make sure you take the opportunity to learn from others. I talk to some young people, and I don't like to call them young people because that makes me feel like I'm an old person, but if you're fresh out of school and you're starting a job as a staff assistant or an intern, you have so much access to free information and expertise here that you really got to take advantage of it. It's a wonderful opportunity. You have information that comes across your desk, read it. You have someone who's coming in for a meeting, they're waiting in your lobby, and you're the staff assistant, ask them some questions. Take an opportunity to learn about different policy areas that might interest you and they may not interest you. For me, it was, and it continues to be, listening to others, understanding and valuing and respecting the perspectives of folks who are coming in to meet with you, whether you agree with them or you disagree with them, or whether your boss has a position and theirs is contrary to your boss's position. There's still, it's understanding the shared value that most of the folks that you're meeting with have. In agriculture, that's promoting rural America. It's promoting our farmers and ranchers and making sure that there is a food system in place for folks like me who like to eat. Again, I've always found that value in listening to the other side and trying to understand their perspective.
In doing some research for this interview, I talked with a former coworker of yours, and he described you as fiercely loyal to both the boss and to the staff. What's the driving force for you behind that loyalty?
Teammates. You got to have teammates, and there's going to be a time in my life, I'm sure there has been in the past, in all of our lives, where we need backup, we need help, and it's your friends and your colleagues who you're going to be able to count on. I want to make sure that not only my boss but my teammates know that they're never going to have to question whether I'm there for them. At the same time, I want to make sure that I'm available and that our system in place is supportive of their professional development. And that's one of the things that's difficult on Capitol Hill with all of the turnover we have, not at the staff level, but just in the management and the leadership of the Hill, and whether it's committees, is being responsible to our staff and their professional development. So that's one thing that's I have found that's been valuable in my life. So I've had great bosses, like I've said, I've had great teammates, and I want to make sure that the folks I work for and work with have that same opportunity. So fiercely loyal, I appreciate that. I don't know who you spoke to, but thank you, whoever you were.
All right, and I'd like to talk a little bit about your current role as Chief of Staff. Just for starters, how would you describe kind of a typical day in the life as a Chief of Staff of the Senate Agriculture Committee?
Well, I think if you talk to some folks in our staff, they think I come in like late, and drink some coffee, have a donut, bark some orders, and then leave. But that's not really how it works. For me, I'm a slow reader, Spencer. I'm a guy who, it takes me longer to get through the morning paper than it probably does other folks. So I like to come in early. It's nice and quiet. I'll read, of course, Agri-Pulse, in the morning, and some of the other news outlets to kind of get myself caught up on the day and what's going on. I try to pay attention to what's going on the floor, even if it's not our issues, and making sure that the chairman's schedule and calendar is ready for the day. And then, kind of once 9 o'clock rolls around and 9:30 rolls around, we're firing on all cylinders. We've got meetings left and right with our policy experts, and then it's just trying to make sure that the schedule of the day goes well, and also making sure that we keep time to think about what's the committee's plan for the future. So I'd love to say it's 4 or 5 meetings a day and a bunch of phone calls, but every day is pretty unique.
Mm-hmm. And during your tenure as Chief of Staff, you've been with the committee in some other roles, but just as Chief of Staff, you've handled or been a part of cool repeal, a GMO labeling or ABT labeling,
ABT, that's
ABT labeling
disclosure
compromise.
too. We'll get it worked out.
Of course. but also looking ahead, probably going to be a 2018 farm bill, hopefully a 2018 farm bill. It depends on the year, how things are going to work out, but a fair amount of things have been on your plate as chief of staff. Which issue do you think has been the favorite issue of yours that you've worked on, either due to personal importance or legislative significance, what have you?
I think, I don't know that I can pick a favorite because probably each of the issues that we've done, there have been times where I would say that is not going to be my favorite issue. But I have been, we've done a lot. The chairman has done a lot. Our staff has done a lot over this last 16 months, however long it's been since we've come on board. Whether it's been biotech, whether it's been child nutrition, we still have a little bit of ways to go here with child nutrition. Cool repeal, as you mentioned, there's a lot of items that we've covered. For me, it's, if you look at each of these items, there is a connection, and it's that connection between how the public perceives their food, whether it's cool, whether it's biotech, whether it's school lunches, school breakfasts. And it's how does this committee work to ensure that consumers and producers are having this conversation together, based on science, based on fact, based on nutrition, and not based on misconception. So that conversation between consumer and producer, I think, brings me a lot of professional joy, I guess you can say, is being able to participate in that.
Now, you've been on the Hill for a little while now, and one of the things that's always interested me about the Hill is that these staffers will come in and they obviously have their own political goals and the things that they want to accomplish and the things that they see as good policy. And sometimes that may not necessarily jive with what the member they're working for sees as good policy. How have you balanced out, maybe not necessarily your policy goals, but maybe if somebody on your staff had a different opinion as far as what the committee should be doing compared to what they actually did? How do you deal with when issues of differences in policy come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that it happens that often. I think there's a couple of metrics that you can use. One, if you're going to be a staffer, you want to be a staffer. You're not going to find a boss or a member who agrees with you 100% of the time. If you can probably clear 70-75% of areas where you agree with your boss, I'd say that's great. Our team, we like to have a dialogue, and there's some areas of policy where some of us have more background and more experience than others, and certainly all of our staff has more professional experience and knowledge than I do. So for me, it's how do we create a conversation where we can ask those questions internally as a team with the boss, with the chairman, and then develop that policy. Now, there are certain fundamentals of ideology, that we all pretty much agree on, and it's getting to the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts where we have to have that conversation. Thankfully, our boss is one who likes to get 4 or 5 people around the table, 4 or 5 folks on his own staff around the table, and have that conversation. So we're able to use dialogue to settle those differences or discrepancies.
And you've worked as both somebody that was in the majority and in the minority in the grand schemes of the Senate chambers. So how do you balance out those policy goals, especially in relation to what is politically viable or achievable as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is a difference between being in the majority and the minority, and what what you're able to do. I think your tactics are different. When you're in the minority, I wouldn't say one is easier or harder than the other. You just have different tools at your disposal. When you're in the minority, you can stop a lot of things just by saying no. When you're in the majority, and as we're finding here in this position, is sometimes it's very challenging to make sure you give everybody a win, and that's what we want to do. Is we want to find wins for all of our members, so they take back home and say, I've heard my constituents and I've produced this result. When you're in the minority, sometimes you just want to say no, and that's very effective. It's very effective.
And I'll finish questions that are on this subject matter with a little more of a lighthearted one. Your boss has been known to throw out the occasional one-liner, even in the scheme of a committee hearing. I mean, he's been known to be a little more chatty than others. I can't imagine what he's like behind the scenes. But in all of your time with him, working for Senator and Chairman Pat Roberts, what's your favorite Senator Pat Roberts story?
I should have seen this question coming. There's so many, and the thing about him at a hearing, and anyone who's worked for him, will have a very similar story. It's that, we as staff, we prepare remarks for him, and then we give them to him, and he edits them, and they come back, and sometimes you just don't know what he's going to say out there. I've always enjoyed what he comes up with on his own. And it's not always the lighthearted stuff. Because that's funny and entertaining for a lot of folks. But he draws in, this wealth of knowledge and history and puts it into his remarks that we as staff just don't have access to. I remember a hearing 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer than that. At the time, USDA Chief Economist Keith Collins was testifying. And we had a set of questions for the chairman, for the senator at the time to ask him. And he puts the paper down, he raises the microphone, and he just looks right at Dr. Collins and he says, "You are one of the best fly speckers I've ever met in my life." And I his vocabulary is a lot greater than mine. And I look over at Seifert and I was like, "Fly specker, is that a compliment? I hope that's a compliment." So there's just a lot of instances like that where he just throws me for a loop, and I find it very entertaining.
All right, let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about you personally.
Oh.
I understand you mentioned you went to Friends University in Kansas. In the interest of full disclosure, I did have to Google that. I had never heard of the institution before then. But I understand
it's the Harvard of Wichita.
Okay. And I understand you played a little college basketball there?
Yeah, I did very little. I played 4 years while I was there, and there's no national championship ring or anything. Like, we had good years, we had bad years. I think I probably led the team in fouls per minute. Good for you. One of those years, but it was great. I enjoyed playing basketball. I still play a little bit now when I can and when my knees allow me to. But it was great, and it was during that kind of college basketball experience that I really kind of developed that appreciation for how successful a team can be together.
Mm-hmm. What's your go-to move on the basketball court?
My go-to move right now it's the grabbing on the shorts and taking a deep breath because I need a rest. I played post. I played down low, so I still have a decent up and under move. It's a lot more under than it is up nowadays, but yeah.
I also understand in efforts to try and stay in shape, you've ran a few Tough Mudders, which just to give folks who might not be familiar with that experience, involves a lot of running through mud, crawling through mud. At some point, there's some electric wires involved. Yes. I could try and make a metaphor here between the Tough Mudder and your work as chief of staff, but to be blunt, I always kind of question the sanity of people that do Tough Mudders.
Well, one, you should question my sanity regardless of the Tough Mudder. So I've done one Tough Mudder.
Okay.
So one of my sisters and I competed in it together. It was in Texas where she and her husband live now, and it was fantastic. It was a lot of climbing, a lot of running in the mud. The electric shock stuff didn't scare me that much because really, how much electricity can they put through you and legally still do this event? Mm-hmm. What I dreaded the most was the ice bath that they did, and they filled a shipping container full of ice water, and they put a divider in the middle of it, and you had to jump in and go under. And I hate the cold. I love the heat. I'll take humidity any day of the week, but when it gets below like 50 degrees, I am miserable. So that it wasn't the electric shock, it wasn't the climbing or the barbed wire or the cages. It was the ice bath that I dreaded the most, but thankfully we survived.
You mentioned a sister. Any other family?
Yeah, I've got 2 brothers, 2 sisters. My parents are still in Kansas. One brother and 1 sister is in Kansas. 1 brother is in Florida, another one in Texas.
Okay, able to get back to Kansas very, very much?
Yeah, we try to. We try to go back to Kansas a couple of times a year, and then my wife's from Nebraska, so we go back to see her family as well. And it's good. I'm looking forward to going back to Kansas again soon.
Very good. And I'll wrap up with this one. If you were to give the version of Joel that walked on to Capitol Hill all those years ago for his first day on the job, what piece of advice would you give him?
I think I didn't realize at that time how lucky I was going to be in the people that came into my life. And so I would tell young Joel, 21-year-old Joel, one, not to go through that phase where I grew my hair out because it didn't look good. But that being aside, is to appreciate the number of folks who come in that become part of your network. Always work to expand your network, but it's not just the number of folks you're connected with, but make sure that you develop those sound relationships with those people who come in. Be attentive to what they're asking for and what they need, but also be appreciative of the opportunity.
Joel, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.